My name's David Bennett. I'm the CEO of Excelerate Systems. Today I'd like to talk to you about the changing roles of CISOs, and it's under this heading of the spread of cybersecurity. And what we're going to talk about is how the role of the CISO has really changed dramatically away from just being a technology expert into something and somebody that really reaches right into the core of any organization. So a little bit about myself first. I've been in technology for over 25 years. I'm currently the CEO and co-founder of Excelerate Systems. We're a security, big data, cloud systems integrator. And I'm also the managing director and co-founder of Eliatra, which is a company that focuses on open search platforms. And as you can see, I've done various roles. So throughout my career, I've really engaged quite heavily with CISOs, CIOs, security directors, and watched as their roles have changed. So let's talk about what the CISO does today. If you think about a traditional CISO, it's very focused on things like compliance and auditing. Most CISOs days are not really structured because they have to assess and respond to current and future threats and breaches often sometimes. They've got to ensure those systems are functioning in line with internal, maybe audit controls, external requirements like regulatory compliance. And historically, they've really focused on building a strong core team of security professionals with good credentials and managing a budget to go with that. So very traditional sort of IT type function with a layer of compliance on top of it, I'd almost say. But as we move forward, you can see that in the present and definitely in the future, the CISO's role is really changing to be one of what we might call a steward or a keeper of the company's security posture. And their role is to really drive what that security posture should look like into the rest of the organization. And as a result, they have to deal with other people in the C-suite, other members of the organizational team across the entire organization who are really not focused on technology. They could be in manufacturing, they could be in the supply chain, they could be in legal and contracts, they could be in sales and marketing, they could be in any function in the organization. And what the CISO has to do is embed this cyber security philosophy, not only in their team, but also in the rest of the organization. And then increasingly, over the last year or so, but particularly from pre-COVID, I think I would say, I see CISOs going up and down the supply chain much more rigorously than they have in the past. And we've all experienced those supplier onboarding processes where either you as the customer or you as the vendor have to get involved in filling out these questionnaires which have lots of requirements about SOC 2 and GDPR and stuff like that. But now what we're seeing is that the CISOs are actually getting into the supply chain, not just asking questions, but making sure that their vendors and their suppliers and other stakeholders are really adopting the cybersecurity standards that they would like to see. And then the other thing I think is relatively new, although I think it's been going a few years, is you'll see other parts of the company that are not involved in security but have to comply with the security requirements, where you've got other managers, directors, C-level executives who are measured and rewarded sometimes by how well they focus on risk management, obviously with a focus on cybersecurity, but not just on cybersecurity. And so you'll see sales directors who are really being measured and rewarded on how they approach risk management. Are they dealing with companies, customers particularly, who are more of a risk than they need to be? And that can be whether it's in the geopolitical sense or in terms of the way those customers' companies are run. And then related to that is the CISO has to set these standards for external stakeholders. So that can be investors, that can be suppliers and customers. And a big part of this that I think is relatively new is we're not just thinking about threats from internal employees and so on, external threats from hackers. We're also thinking about nation states that are looking to impose themselves through breaking through the network into the organization. Maybe you're a utility, maybe you're a bank, obviously you can be a government, and those nation-state threats have we seen over the past couple of years have been quite significant. And so that whole basis of the CISO with a relatively narrow function around compliance and technology, a team and management of budget, I think has really broadened out into a role that goes up and down across the whole organization and then out into the supply chain and other external stakeholders. So let's think about classic job descriptions, and I'm making this point so that you can see these are no longer relevant. So we can look at lots of examples of job descriptions for CISOs, but these are just two from Tech Target and from Better Team, which is a recruitment site. So you can see these typical job descriptions, they're really focused on technology more than anything else. And my assertion is that technology is really becoming less and less important as a skill set for CISOs. You obviously have to have a team that has strong technology skills, but as a CISO, you've got to be much more than that, much more focused on the qualitative and objective parts of the organization and what your company is or your organization is aiming for. So if you as an organization are looking to recruit CISOs that fit these types of job descriptions, I would say you're a bit behind the curve in terms of what a CISO is ultimately going to have to do in the coming years. So let's think about some rather more forward-looking concepts here. So this lady is Jamaica Green-Aron. She's the CISO of Auth0, which is an authentication authorization software vendor. And you can see in her quote here, she's saying that it doesn't really center around technology. It's much more around being accountable to the rest of the organization on whether you're meeting the cybersecurity standards as an organization that your investors or your board or whatever your stakeholders are to be accountable for those standards. And that's really not just about technology, as you can see. And then we have this sort of second definition from Forbes about the evolving role of CISOs from July. And you can see here there really isn't much, again, about technology. There's concepts about strategic thinking, decision making, influencing, which I think is becoming very important in the role of CISOs. You can't go to other parts of the organization and say, this is what you must do. You have to influence and convince them that what you're proposing is the right thing to do. And CISOs really can't just rely on their technical knowledge alone to respond to these threats. Again, recognizing those can be national players as well as external hackers and so on. And fundamentally, I think with this concept, the last phrase is the key one. Cybersecurity isn't just the concern now of the technology teams that formerly have been responsible for it. Cybersecurity is the concern of almost every part of the organization, whether it's sales and marketing or finance or production or development if you're in the technology arena, or manufacturing or procurement or purchasing. All these things really have to be run with that philosophy of cybersecurity that you as the CISO have to establish and enrich as you go forward. So this is really a comparison. So I mentioned earlier on about these questionnaires that are out there. This is one that I'm familiar with. It just goes through a whole list of questions, and there can be hundreds, as many of you will have experienced. And the question is, what does this do as a process to enhance your risk profile? And my sort of proposition is it doesn't really do much, because you push this out to a supplier, They answer it in the way that they run their cybersecurity posture or profile, and then it comes back in, and so long as all the boxes are ticked, purchasing say, okay, you can buy from this vendor. But it doesn't really drive philosophies that benefit your organization up and down the supply chain. And so that's where this whole concept of stewardship, as I mentioned earlier, comes in. We're really trying to set the whole company posture and drive that awareness of what the cybersecurity and the risk management profile is into the whole organization. Part of that is to advise and mentor the non-IT key staff. So let's say you have a COO who's a very traditional, manufacturing COO. They're maybe possibly thinking, well, this stuff is really, not that important to manufacturing, but as we all know, it is. And so you're becoming much more of a mentor rather than a knowledge source, how to get non-IT key staff to adopt the risk management principles that you think are necessary and the company thinks are necessary. And that applies, as we mentioned, into not just internally, but also up and down the supply chain. And this involves you as the CISO, I've seen this many times, actually going to your key suppliers and making sure that their cybersecurity standards are aligned with yours, but also making sure that yours are aligned with theirs. And so there's a sort of consistency, if you like, up and down the supply chain that will allow you to manage those cybersecurity threats more effectively. So it does involve not directing your suppliers to do things, but actually working in a more consultative and cooperative way. I think one of the things that I've seen many CISOs struggle with really is this one where they have to say, I've got a set of metrics here that I want you as a non-IT person to be managed and rewarded on. And this is changing, but as you see, let's say, previous generations try and work through this process, there has been a lot of pushback on, well, I'm in distribution. Why am I being measured on metrics related to cybersecurity and risk management? Whereas I think as you see next generations come in, particularly the latest generation, Gen Z, which is the first purely 100% digital generation, there's a much higher acceptance that this is just part of the nature of work. But you as the CISO have to set the standards and be the arbiter or the decider of what those standards are, and also who should get measured on them and how. And that gives you, again, a much broader sweep across the organization than simply being a knowledge center of how to avoid threats. We talked about setting standards externally, but there's not just suppliers and customers, there's others. Investors is one of the key ones. So you need to be sure that whether you're a public company or a private company, that your investors are really bought into the metrics and the risk profile and the risk management standards that you've set, so that they don't prejudice that either through actions in the stock market or even through their own private and personal actions. And the final thing I would say on these new challenges is traditionally CISOs have had maybe not total control over what it is they've tried to do, but more in terms of how they control things. And as the spread of technology awareness and the digital generations that I just mentioned start to move into management positions as they already are, you as the CISO have to accept a loss of control, but also embrace an increase in your profile. And that, I think, is something that a lot of CISOs I see are welcoming, but still trying to work out, well, how do I do that? You've still got all the old challenges. The CISO is expected to be this superhero with this, CISO comic universe behind them of really skilled technology experts to do all these things, maintaining the risk register, performing situation reports, intelligence update management, working in an environment where you know the schedule will be disrupted every day, all the time by something. And as we've seen, this is not a new thing. CISOs do suffer, I wouldn't say more than most, but they definitely do suffer from their own personal stress issues and sometimes burnout. So the challenge, if you like, for the new generation of CISOs is there's all these new requirements and new aspects of their job that I think will raise their profile and make them much more important to the overall organization. But underlying that is still all the old challenges that we're all familiar with. And so you can't lose sight of the fact that you need to be a technology expert, but you need to be more than just a technology expert, as we've discussed already. So in conclusion, I think it's really about more than internal and external commercial threats. I think you need to think about how your company could be a target for a foreign power, not just commercial hackers, internal threats, and so on. It does depend what sector you're in, but there's definitely an aspect of that, increasingly so in the last few years. And I think one of the things that CISOs are gradually getting their hands around, particularly again, as I mentioned, with this digital generational change, is many cyber threats are not actually reported. And there was a report, I think it was a couple of years back, sort of during COVID, but only 1 in 7 cybercrimes, so that includes consumers as well as businesses, but I still think it's relevant, only 1 in 7 cybercrimes is reported. And so in your company, you're not necessarily seeing the entire picture. A, because employees don't want to report issues because they think that might cause them a problem. Employees don't want to report issues they've observed with other employees because that might get them into difficulty. And so as a CISO, I think there's a very sort of strong requirement to not be too authoritative and be more consultative and set up an environment where issues and problems can be reported without fear of retribution. And as we already mentioned, the role is definitely evolving. It's definitely going up the hierarchy, but it's becoming much more of a multifunctional and multidisciplinary role, not just about the technology. So I hope you found that helpful. It's definitely a moving target at the moment. We talk to CISOs on a regular basis, and if any of you would like to just chat or contact us about something more specific, my contact details are here. So thanks for your time, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.